Hello world, Noah here, and welcome to the lab for the input lesson. In this lab, we're going to solve this fairly simple problem that we have right here, but this will make sure that you understand everything that we just went over in the corresponding lecture. And so the problem is very simple. Write a program that asks the user to enter two numbers and then calculates their sum. And so obviously if I gave you two variables and I said calculate their sum, if the variables are called a and b, you'd just write a plus b and you'd be done. So the part that's a little bit tricky here is that we have to deal with the user input, right? And so that's what we just learned. That's the goal of this exercise. And so let's go ahead and get started with that. So we need to ask the user to enter two numbers. That's the first part. And so let's get that, let's sort of do a little bit with that first. What do we want to name these two numbers? I'm just going to call them A and B. I mean, you could call them number 1 and number 2 if you want. And usually we want to have some more, some good descriptive variable names. But here they're just two numbers, and I don't know anything better. You call them X and Y. I'm just going to call them A and B. So we'll call them A and B, and we want to get the user's input. And so first, we'll say A is equal to, remember, to get the user's input, use the input function. So you write the word input, and you write some parentheses like that. Then we'll say B is equal to input. Just like that. So we've asked the user, the user is going to enter, two inputs, and we're going to store them into A and B. And hopefully you see a few things wrong with what we have so far. But let's just pretend for a second that this is right, and then we'll try to run the code and see what happens. Before we do that, we want to print out the sum. Okay, we want to print out the sum. What's the sum? It's just A plus B. So that's not the hard part. The hard part is obviously not the sum. It's dealing with the user's input. And so here we've written a program where the user is going to enter two things, and they're going to be stored to the variables A and B, and then we print out the sum, A plus B, right? And so hopefully you realize that this program is not going to work as we intend it to, but let's give it a try. And I think if we fix the problems one at a time, it'll become, more clear as to how, everything plays in. And then also if you're writing programs and trying to debug them yourself, maybe you'll follow a similar process to this. So let's go ahead and run the code. It's running right now. And you'll notice, okay, it's waiting for me to input something. I know that because, I have access to the code right here. But if you gave this to your friend and said, here, run my nice program, they would probably think that the program is frozen because nothing's happening. But okay, let's go ahead and test it first, and then we can deal with that. So, I'll type in the number 1. Now it's waiting for my second input. I'll type in 2. And it gives the answer 12. That's really weird, right? Because 1 plus 2 is not 12. But what happened? Maybe it's a little bit tricky to see it, or maybe you see it immediately. But what actually happened was it took the 1 and the 2, and it did sort of add them together, but all it did was it took the 1 and it stuck the 2 after it, right? And why did this happen? Well, it happened because, remember, the input function always returns strings. And so when I typed in 1, it was 1 the string, not 1 the integer, and 2 was also a string. And when you add two strings together, it concatenates them, which means it takes the first one and it sticks the second one at the end of it, which is what happened. It took the first string 1 and it stuck the second string, which is 2, right after it, like that. And so that's the reason why we got this wrong answer, and obviously we want to fix that. And then we also want to fix the issue, when we run the program, it's not super obvious as to, what exactly is going on, what should be happening. And so let's fix the first problem where the program's a little confusing, and then we'll fix the string versus integer problem second. And so to fix that first problem, there's two things that you can do, and we can take a look at both of them, and you can decide which one you like better. So the first thing you could do is you could simply add a print statement, and say something like, please enter two numbers, just like that. And notice that I put the print statement before the input statements, right? Because when Python gets to an input statement, it's going to halt the program and wait for the user to type something in. And so if you put the print statement afterwards, it would say, please enter two numbers after the user already enters the numbers, which is not what we want. So we put this first, please enter two numbers. And if I run it again, okay, now it's more clear, please enter two numbers. So, 1, 2. And of course it still doesn't work, but the point is that, it actually makes a lot more sense. It gives two outputs. The problem, though, with this, and this is fine, but if you do something like 1 space 2, okay, so I just typed in two numbers. I never said, please enter two numbers. You could write, please enter, two numbers, one per line if you want. But the point is when I type in 1 space 2, that counts as one input. And so if I go and type in another number, I get this weird thing, 1, 2, 3, right? Because it's taking this string 1 space 2 and it's sticking the 3 on the end of it. And so I would say if you're going to go with this method, you'd probably want to be more clear to say, please enter two numbers, one per line. Because a user could type something like this and think, that that's perfectly valid, which it looks like it's valid, but it wouldn't work here. And so, let's comment that out because we could try it a different way. We could use the prompt parameter for the input. And so again, what you do for that is inside of the parentheses, you put a string, and this is the message that the user will see right in front of their input. So for example, please enter a number. And I'm going to write a colon and a space because remember the user input comes right after this message on the same line. And then here I would say something like, please enter another number, just like that. And so now let's give this a try. So it says, please enter a number, and see the cursor's right here. It's waiting for me. I'll type in 1 and I'll hit enter. Now it says, please enter another number, and it's waiting for me again right here. So I'll type in another number. And, it gives the same output, but the point is that it works. And so here, I think this is really, really clear as to exactly what's going on. You say, please enter a number, and I enter the number. I'm only entering one number at a time, and it's on the same line as this input, so it makes it, very clear that this is the first number. And then here, please enter another number. It gives me another prompt. Again, I enter a single number at once, and it's on the same line, and then I get my output. So personally, I think that this is generally better, than using a print statement, but you could argue, this is more verbose, right? It says, please enter a number, please enter another number. There's these two messages, whereas here there is only one message. And so it's honestly up to you. It's really a design choice. They're both perfectly valid. But I think that using the prompt for the input, I think that this looks a little bit better, in my opinion. And so I would recommend this, at least give it a try, even if you decide to use, the print statements later. But let's actually fix, this other issue where the output that it gives is, not what we want. And so what we said was the input function always returns a string. It always gives us back a string, which makes a lot of sense because the user input could be anything that the user could type in. It could be letters, numbers, symbols, whatever. And if it happens to be a number, we don't want it to return an integer because then it's inconsistent and it can be kind of confusing. If we have it always return a string, it's always consistent, which is a good thing even if it seems like it isn't. You're just gonna have to take my word for it. But what we can do to deal with that is we get this user input and we want to convert it to an integer, and we do that using the int function, right? So all you do is you take the input part, so this is what we had before, and you wrap it inside of a call to the int function, right? So we say int, and then in the parentheses we put the thing that we want to convert, which is whatever the user input is. And don't worry if this is confusing, if it doesn't really make sense. This is dealing with functions, which we're going to get to a little bit later on. So I would say take my word for it. Try to understand it. Hopefully it makes a little bit of sense, but take my word for it, and eventually it'll be a little bit more clear if it's not clear enough yet. But we do this, so we're saying we want to get the user's input, and then we want to convert it to an integer, and we'll do the same thing with the other one. And so again, it's going to work from the inside out, so it's going to get the user input first, and then convert it to an integer, and then assign it to the variable a, and it'll do the same thing for b. And so let's run this now. Please enter a number, let's do 1. Please enter another number, let's do 2. And now it gives us the expected output of 3, right? Because we told it, treat these two inputs as integers, just like that. And so therefore, it's going to give us the output that we expect, which is 3. Now, just to show you, if I run this again, and I say, please enter a number, and I type something that's not a valid number, it's going to give me an error message. And this looks kind of ugly, but if you read this line right here, I think it's pretty clear. Value error, invalid literal for int, a. Point is invalid, int, and a. I think, if you ignore the rest of this, it's pretty clear. A is not a valid integer, and so therefore it crashes with an error. And eventually we'll learn how to, deal with this error, how to handle it. But for now, we'll just let the program crash. And for simple programs that we're going to be writing, it'll be fine because the user will type in the correct input, or it'll crash and they'll try again. Now, just to show you one other issue with this is if I try to type in, a number with a decimal place, it gives an error too. And this may be confusing because I said, enter a number. I never said to enter a whole number or an integer, right? And so you have two choices. If you want the user to enter, only whole numbers, you could write, please enter a whole number. Or if you asked, enter the number of friends and the number of cookies, I think it's implied that those would be whole numbers. But in this case, if we're just adding two numbers, we should allow them to type in numbers with decimal places. And so instead of using the int function, we just use the float function. And it works the exact same way as the int function. You can just replace the word int with the word float. And now what will happen is the user input will be converted into a floating point number instead of an integer. And so just to show you, if I type in my same inputs as before, 1 and 2, it'll give the output of 3.0, right? Because it's it takes the input of 1, and when it converts it to a float, it becomes 1.0. Takes 2, becomes 2.0, and 1.0 plus 2.0 is 3.0, of course. But now this will work if I run it and I type in 1.2 and 3.4. Now it gives 4.6, which is the correct answer. And the point is that it now works with decimal numbers as well. And then of course, if I run this again and I type something invalid, it'll fail. And it gives us a little bit of a different error message, but it says could not convert string to float. And I think this is even more clear than this error message up here. I think they're both clear, but this is very clear. This A could not convert to a float. Okay, it's clearly not a valid, floating point number, a valid decimal place number. And so the program will still crash. But this right here, I think, is the best program that you could write to do this, aside from handling the errors, which we're not going to worry about at this point. But just to review, we're asking the user for two numbers. For each number, we know that the input will give us a string, so we need to convert it into a float so that we can treat it like a number. We're storing it in these variables a and b, and then all we do is we do a plus b, and we print out the result, which is what we want to do. We want to calculate the sum of these two numbers. And so that's all for this lab. This was a pretty simple one, but I think it was good to be thorough on all the concepts because input can be a little tricky, but it's very important because pretty much any Python program you write is going to have some sort of user input, and so this is definitely something that you want to master. So I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Bye for now.